So please give a very warm SPA welcome to Andrew Large, Director General of the CPI.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that very kind introduction. They always say with the presentation that you should focus on the one key message that you want to give people. And the one key message that I want to leave you all with today is now is the time to be thinking about your preparations for no deal. On the balance of risks to your industry, to your business, now is really the time when these risks are starting to crystallise and people need to think about their preparedness and their planning and their what-if scenarios for what is still the possibility rather than the likelihood, but I would suggest maybe at the moment the 40% possibility of the UK leaving the European Union in just on 6 months' time without a deal. So what I'm going to do, I spoke at this conference maybe about 18 months ago about the issue of Brexit and where we stand at the moment. And I've been asked back, and I'm very grateful to the SPA for inviting me back to give an update on what the current situation is. So I'm going to very quickly go through the underlying rationale behind Brexit, why we are where we are, talk about the time frame, talk about the state of play of the negotiations, and then I hope to spend the bulk of my time trying to talk about some of the key issues that I think are relevant for planning for no deal. So I've shown this graph before, but I think it's worthwhile reiterating that the interesting point is down here, the decline of the developed world middle class. Because these are the people who used to be manufacturing jobs, used to work in the steel industry, used to work in the coal mines, used to work in the shipyards, and because of the way that the UK has changed from 88 going forwards, they are now the people who voted for Brexit. To give you an idea of where everybody else is on that chart, these are your sub-Saharan African subsistence farmers for whom modern agriculture and modern life really hasn't changed their economic prospects very much. Up here, that's Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and people like that. And these people here, they are the people in China whose parents were subsistence farmers, but they work for Foxconn making mobile phones. They live in a town, they maybe own their own phone, they have more of a disposable income, more of a consumer lifestyle, and they've seen their real income growth very, very high indeed. Poorest have seen very little growth at all, and the people who've seen declines in their relative income are people who were working in the old industrial areas of the UK, and those are the people who voted to leave the European Union. Now this, of course, posits Brexit as being an issue of economics, and I understand it's more than that, but these are the underlying tensions, economic tensions, that if you go to places like Hull or Newport or Glenrothes or places like that, those are the places that you see that sort of incidence in reality, in the real world. So moving on to the time frame, this is an incredibly busy slide. I'm so glad that Tim said you're going to get copies of all of this. But what I encourage you to look at is between October 2018 and January 2019, just how much has got to happen. We are suffering from what you might call fixture congestion in the European negotiations. We have a European Council every month, potentially, from October, November, December, and at those European Councils, decisions are going to be taken about what the Brexit deal might look like, whether it will pass the UK Parliament, whether it will pass the European Parliament, whether the Commission and the government can come to an agreement. So the next 3 months in UK politics are going to be extremely interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. There is simply somebody somewhere has got to give. If you listen to people's public pronouncements on where they stand is miles apart from each other. Between Jacob Rees-Mogg and Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk and so on, there is absolute clear water. Something needs to be done to bring those groups sufficiently close together so that we get a deal. Because if we don't, then we will be leaving without a deal, and with all the negative consequences of that will come to the fore. Another key date, just before I move on, 21st of January 2019. Written into the Withdrawal Act is a requirement on the British government to make a report to Parliament on or after the 21st of January 2019 on what is going to happen if no deal is reached. So that is going to become the key milestone. Now obviously one hopes that somewhere up there we'll have an agreement, but we may not. And if we don't, then this is going to be the key point when the government is going to have to say in public, this is what happens next. And we will see what happens if we get to that juncture. To look at the time frame in a sort of more graphic way, we've got to this point, we're still having the conversation, we're trying to develop a draft deal to put to the European Council. At the end of the 2 years, either we get into an agreement or we have no deal. So we're approaching the fork in the road, and that is now getting to be a very short distance of time indeed. So a little bit about the state of play. This is the famous staircase chart that people may have seen or may have seen reference to. And basically what that is, it starts with EU membership up at that end. It takes all the UK's red lines down the bottom, and it says, where do they leave us? And basically what it says is, from the European Commission's point of view, with all the UK red lines here, we can't be in the same place as Norway, we can't be in the same place as Switzerland, can't be in the same place as Ukraine, can't be in the same place as Turkey. All that's left for us is to be in the same place as South Korea, Canada, or WTO type relationship. So from the European Union's perspective, this is where we're at, unless the UK changes its red lines. And you'll hear talk about Canada Plus, and Canada Plus Plus, and Canada Plus 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 Plus. These are all about the extent to which these red lines can be made pink, or dotted, or blurred, and how much we can possibly go up the line of having our own trade policy, having a bit more regulatory coherence, having a bit more free movement perhaps, and maybe making a bit of a substantial financial contribution. So the extent to which the UK's red lines get blurred, there's more opportunities to climb up that ladder. And we will see where we end up. State of play from the UK side, this is Chequers. This is a nice little press photograph taken during the famous Chequers meeting that produced the famous Chequers agreement that may or may not be an agreement about anything at all. And the UK is looking for four things. Common rule book, joint jurisdiction. So basically what that means is that the UK and the EU together decide what is in compliance with a facilitated customs arrangement, which is essentially a vehicle where the UK agrees to implement EU customs law, the EU agrees to implement UK customs law when it comes to cross-channel traffic, and the end of free movement. Now, you will readily see that we're asking for a bit of that one, we're asking for a bit of that one, we're asking for a bit of that one, and we're asking for a bit of that one. So the UK's position is very much about trying to unpick bits of these red lines and play with them. And the European position is, no, you want to unpick these things, you're down here. And therein, if you like, is the difficulty. And of course, this is all compounded after the Salzburg informal summit of about 2.5 weeks ago, where Theresa May was saying, it's Chequers or it's no deal, and Donald Tusk was saying, no to Chequers. And you can see that the relationships have now begun to break down really quite substantially. This is Donald Tusk's official Instagram account, basically trolling Theresa May in a way that you might expect Donald Trump to do, for example. Not only is it perhaps a little insensitive to talk about cake to a diabetic, but then also to do the cherry picking bit as well. You know, it's really, really having a dig. And I would question whether that is conducive to having the kind of negotiation that you're going to need to have to get an agreement. And I would add at this point that actually one of the problems about getting this agreement is because the two sides are starting from a different point of departure. For the EU, the European Union is a spiritual thing. It is the guarantor of peace in Europe. Go back to 1952 with the Coal and Steel Treaty. That was about taking the coal and steel assets of France and Germany and putting them under common ownership. so that the mistakes of 1870, 1914 and 1939 could not be made again. You could not fight over the resources of Europe anymore. For the UK, it's about economics. We joined in the 1970s when we were in a bad way as a country, and we've always taken a much more transactional view of it, which says European Union is good for us because the UK is better off in terms of GDP as a result. So when we're coming forward with economically rational arguments, and basically all of this is reasonably economically rational, we are coming up against what is basically a spiritual approach that says the system is more important than the actual economic outcome of the particular things that are done. And I think that's, to my mind at least, important in trying to understand why it is that the EU 27 and the UK seem to be talking past each other a lot. It's because we're starting from a completely different point of departure for what's important and what's not. So, I'd like to move on now to talk about planning for no deal, because I think that's the most important thing that's on the agenda today. And I would reiterate, now is the time to really put those plans into place and to be able to push the button on them, because the likelihood of no deal is growing. And you can look at the impact of uncertainty on UK GDP growth. Go back to 2014, UK was the fastest growing G7 economy. Look to 2016, second fastest, still doing very well. Look at 2018, slowest growing economy in the G7. And so you might have seen some newspaper reports in the last week or so about the price of Brexit already being £500 million a year, sorry, £500 million a week rather, that the impact has already been felt in terms of lost GDP, in terms of lost opportunity, and there it is. That's the proof of the data. It's the Brexit uncertainty that has cut economic growth, and in doing so has cost the UK billions already. So when people talk about Brexit dividends and they talk about being able to leave and opportunities and so on, we need to factor in the damage that's already been done to the UK economy just by the uncertainty of the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, one hopes that will be a deal. And I think it's worthwhile presenting the optimistic case first and saying what happens if there is a deal. So, the UK will exit the European Union on the 29th of March 2019 at 11 p.m. Why 11 p.m? So it's midnight for the continental Europeans, who are an hour ahead of us. There's been some joking about the fact that they're changing the clocks going forward and the clocks going back in the European level. And there might be a point at which, if the UK clocks don't go forwards, but the European ones do, there'll be an hour space when there'll be no law at all. But I wouldn't bank on that if I were you. The withdrawal agreement that's already agreed in principle says that there'll be an implementation period that will allow a managed transition to the end of 2020. So we'd be able to not leave off a cliff edge, but instead there's a glide path down to the new regulatory situation. You'd then have the negotiations about the long-term trade relationship during that time and move to a long-term position from the 1st of January 2021. You may have heard today there's already some conversations going on about potentially extending a customs union arrangement for the UK till the end of 2022 to make it coterminous with the next UK general election. Who knows? It's part of the melting pot of the discussions that are going to happen over the next couple of months and that will decide to a very great extent what the trading future of this country is. But I think we need to talk about the planning for no deal. And I think one of the messages I'd like to leave you with is that UK corrugated-based industries are particularly vulnerable to a no-deal situation. And it's worthwhile saying why. It's cross-UK ownership. Sorry, cross-EU ownership. So the supply of capital, the supply of machinery, the supply of raw materials, regularly crossing the channel. And that is a challenge before we even start. You add to that then a cross-European customer base. So a lot of the products that you produce going back across the channel in some way, shape or form, either in and of themselves or alternatively around other products that are being shipped and exported. And to an extent, although not as much as for some sectors like hospitality, There's also a cross-European supply of labour. And that means that this industry is particularly vulnerable to a no-deal outcome. And the thing about no deal is it could lead to an overnight change in circumstances. No transitional arrangements, no glide path, no opportunity to plan. 11 PM, 29th of March, it all changes. And there's a principle of what you would call least regrets planning that many of you may be aware of, which basically means what can I do today that will cause me the least regret in the future? And I would argue very strongly that you would regret least planning for no deal that eventually you didn't have to use because there was a deal, rather than not planning for no deal and then finding yourself staring over the edge of a cliff with days to go in March of next year. So let's move on now and talk about particular areas where no deal is going to be an issue. First area, at the border itself. One of the things that will happen in the event of no deal is that there will be border checks. Do the products conform to what the paperwork says? Do they conform to European standards? In the absence of a deal, that won't be able to be assessed in the UK, as it currently is. So there will be checks at the border, probably on every shipment, to say, does this comply or not? A little bit of good news is that paper and paper products do not have a tariff on them. But the bad news is that other products that may be used, be they inks, be they starches, be they other processing chemicals that you may use, may well have tariffs on them. And one of the preparedness things that you can do is to find out which products you currently use that do have product tariffs at a WTO level, potentially either look for UK alternative suppliers for those, or alternatively look for non-EU suppliers if you have to import them, so that at least you're familiar then with your supply chain and you'll be able to have an alternative if you need. Other issue here is called rules of origin. What does rules of origin mean? It is, what does it take to determine that a product is made in Britain? What is the substantial transformation? What is the value added that is in place? And in the absence of an agreement, the European Union will probably impose its own rules of origin. And they will say for a product to be determined as being British for the purposes of trade, it will have to have a certain percentage value added in the UK or a certain percentage of local content. And you will need to be clear as to what that is and what potentially the parameters are for determining whether a product is British or not. Moving on to logistics, the picture you can see there is Operation Stack from about 2015. Operation Stack is when there are ferry strikes or something similar and they need to use the M20 for parking. And when the M20 is full, they use Manston Airfield. Back in 2015, it took about 4 to 6 hours for a lorry to clear that traffic jam and get itself up to the port. You may also have heard mention of a thing called Operation Brock, Brock standing for Brexit Operations Across Kent. The Port of Dover is predicting that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, there will be 15+ mile queues of lorries trying to get into Dover. And so, from your point of view, how can you manage that? Can you go to an alternative port, for example? Dover is going to be the focus for lots of these things, but are there other ports you can use for your logistics? Can you stockpile materials so that you don't necessarily need the just-in-time, while the chaos sorts itself out? Can you time your shutdown? You may have heard that BMW Mini at Cowley are doing a full shutdown in April next year. It's their standard maintenance month when they shut down. They're moving it forwards so they can take it directly after Brexit, and in the hope of doing so are able to free themselves up from some of the potential chaos that takes place. It's one of those examples of those things that is low cost, because they were going to do it anyway, but high value in terms of moving the timing of it. There's also an issue of driving licences. One of the things that came out of the European papers that the UK government has recently issued is that UK driving licences will no longer be valid in Europe. And therefore your UK lorry driver, who has been driving very nicely in Europe for very many years on his UK licence, will no longer be allowed to do so. That would not be sufficient documentation. You have to apply for the relevant international driving licence, and then the UK will have to ratify, I think it's either the Geneva or the Vienna Convention around international driving permits, before the UK is in a position to issue these permits to give UK drivers the right to drive in the European Union. So you can see that already, if you get to February and all of a sudden you're approaching DVLA for one of these documents, you're going to join the back of a very, very long queue. So the time to prepare is now. What documents do you need? Who has what right to drive where? And are you able to make advanced preparations for these international driving permits that are going to be required in the event of no deal taking place?
Andrew, one assumes that if your logistics at the moment are driven, or your wagons are driven by Polish or European residents, that they too will have to do something to get the prerequisite licence for driving in the UK.
The UK government hasn't been clear about that yet. They've made some general statements that people who are already here will be allowed to work and continue to live their lives as they have done so. Presumably your Polish worker would be in possession of a UK driving licence. Therefore, if he's in possession of a UK driving licence, then he would need to have an international permit. If he already has a Polish licence, that Polish licence should be fine in the European Union of 27, but may or may not be fine in the UK. And as I say, the UK has made general statements about the residents from the EU 27 being allowed to continue what they do, but they haven't specifically said this licence, this licence, this licence is fine. As to the legality of somebody driving on their UK licence up to the ferry and then driving on their Polish licence over the other side, in theory that should be okay, but in practice I don't know. One would need to ask. One would need to find out what that did to insurance, for example, as much as anything else. Customs. On the slide you'll see a web link. This is a very useful page on the European Commission's website that sets out all the documentation that is required for third country importers into the European Union. And in the event of no deal, the UK will be a third country importer. So we have the commercial invoice, the customs value declaration, the Theatre bill of lading, whatever that may be, the railway bill, the TIR carnet, etc., etc., etc. Some people may be familiar with that because they may already be trading with non-EU countries, but not everybody will be. And it is very complicated. I've just broken out specifically from the commercial invoice. These are all the pieces of information that you would need to have. And for each of these elements here, there's another list about as long. Now you can imagine you won't necessarily have to hand the Incoterms detail of the particular shipment you're making. So you'll have to get that. Now what do you do if your roadway bill says such and such a company PLC and your company up here says such and such a company limited, just because somebody's typed it differently? You can bet your bottom dollar that if there's a discrepancy between two pieces of documentation, then the customs officer in Calais is going to say no. They'll do it because that's their job. And we were going to have to be absolutely meticulously precise in the quality of the data and the detail that we're going to be able to give people. Because if we're not, then we're really going to struggle in terms of getting these materials over the border. And again, there will also be customs inspections. Does what it says on the paperwork correspond with what's in the back of the lorry? Because obviously the European Union will be wanting to ensure that it's not going to fall victim to fraud. One good piece of news is on VAT. There was some concern that all VAT would need to be paid on a transaction-by-transaction basis for imports from the European Union. The government has now said that all VAT on all imports from any country can now be paid on a quarterly arrears basis. So that at least is one piece of good news, that the cash flow implications of potential changes to VAT policy are going to be managed. Moving on, look at the complexity of supply chains. That's a VW Golf that's been broken out there. The numbers of different parts, the number of times those parts have gone across the channel. And we've got to start talking about what's your supply chain exposure to Brexit as well. Where are your customers and your suppliers? So, suppliers of board or of paper, where are you getting it from? Are there challenges with that coming across the channel? Are there any particular chemicals you might be using? I was having a very interesting conversation with a paper maker a few weeks ago who was saying, we've been through all of this and we've got one chemical that we buy from Belgium and we can only get it from Belgium. And that's where we're really focusing our attention to try and find another supplier. So it's drilling down to that level of detail. And it's also about where are you with your customer base. Much corrugated packaging goes into the food and drink sector. And the food and drink sector is going to be very, very severely affected by no deal because of the sanitary and phytosanitary arrangements and the import licensing arrangements for food trade into the EU, potentially incredibly challenging. So again, things to be aware of. Who are your customer base? Start asking them some questions about where they're trading with, and it will help you work with them to make the preparations that you need. Regulatory stability. We no more UK eco-labels. No more UK sites will be covered by the eco-management and audit system. EU ETS, which is for energy, we don't know what the situation is going to be after March. We don't know whether we'll be in it or out of it or parallel to it or whatever. We don't know what the REACH arrangements will be. In theory, the UK government is saying they're going to set up a parallel chemical regulatory system. But in practice, there isn't the time or the resource to be able to do it. And we don't know where the UK is going to be with regard to SEN or SENELEC. Currently, BSI is a member of both of those, but post-Brexit, without a deal, probably won't be. So there'll be all these European standards that cover products that are of interest to you that we won't necessarily have any kind of say over. Etc., 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 ad infinitum. There are hundreds of these sorts of things that we could look at. Legal and contract certainty. I'm conscious of time, so I should just focus on this one here. People laughed at Ryanair when they started saying they were going to change their T's and C's in order to give them an exemption from paying compensation to travellers in the event of Brexit-related disruption. Now that the official British government document says that it's quite possible that flights won't fly on the 29th of March and onwards in the event of a no-deal Brexit, then they're not looking quite as stupid as they were. The point is, what do your contracts say? What do your warranties say? Is there anything that you're telling your customers that depends upon the UK's membership of the EU to happen? So if you're offering a warranty to members that says that you'll supply within 12 hours if there's a problem, and then you can't because of all the customs problems and so on, then where's the liability? You need to start thinking about these kinds of contractual issues now, potentially going to your customers and saying, we need to talk about what is force majeure here, we need to talk about what are the contractual positions here. Employment. There's been freedom of movement for employment. I imagine everybody in this room is working alongside people who come from another EU member state. The government has been making nice noises about continuing to protect their position in the UK. I think it's probably fair to say that people you've got working today will continue to be able to work today. But I think it's also fair to say that in the event of no deal, the people that you might want to recruit, you may not be able to recruit. And if people for some reason leave the UK, I think it's going to be difficult for them to come back. So, well, as the graphic shows, there will be a rubbing out of the bridge in the event of no deal in terms of access to new entrants to the labour market from across the European Union. Clearly, in the event of a deal, it says very clearly in the withdrawal treaty that there are continued rights for people to live and work freely across the EU 27 plus 1, as it were. But in the event of no deal, much less likely. And finally, I can only stress the importance of communications. Now is the time to start talking to your suppliers, to start talking to your employees, your subcontractors, and to start talking to your customers and start working collaboratively to understand what are the risks to your particular business for Brexit. Because not everything I just described will apply to everybody. And there are things that may apply to people that I haven't got on there. But unless you start talking, you're not going to find out what your particular pinch points are. What's your equivalent of that particular little Belgian chemical that that particular company can't get anywhere else? And you need to start doing that now, because the time is running out. I think we're on about 170 days between now and Brexit. The time is running out for people to take choices about what they're going to do differently and to then implement those choices so that whatever happens on March 29th, your business can continue to trade successfully. So in conclusion, ask yourselves what your business can control and what it can influence. Ask what's going to be likely to cause an impact and what those impacts are going to be most damaging. It's a classic risk management business continuity exercise. But you need to do it now. Because while I'd love to be an optimist, and I'd love to be able to stand up here and say the deal is done, and Theresa May and Donald Tusk are going to shake hands, and it's all going to be fine, there's at least a 40% chance that it won't be. And even if the deal is done, getting it through the UK Parliament, the European Parliament, the parliaments of the 27 member states, it's not a given. And I estimate that the chances of no deal are at least 40%. And on that basis, it's very, very sensible to start planning to try and minimise the impacts on your own businesses. So thank you very much.
Thank you.